Okay, so let's start with Moonlight. How might Moonlight help elucidate some of the points that Bordwell is making about art, cinema, narration? First, you can actually glean a clue from the poster for the film. The tagline of the poster and of the film is, "This is the story of a lifetime." Of course, it's a bit of a double entendre, story of a lifetime meaning this momentous, important story, but also the story trying to represent the lifetime of a single human being. And that actually helps us clarify one of the particular kinds of stories that art, cinema, narration is drawn to. Bordwell says, especially apt for the broken teleology of the art film is the biography of the individual, in which events become pared down toward a picaresque successivity. To clarify, what he's saying is a lot of art films tend to be organized around telling the story of a life of a person, not necessarily giving us a lead character with a set of goals to be achieved. When he says picaresque successivity, he means that we might get a series of events that follow each other, but not necessarily a strong causal relationship between them. I want to keep that in mind as we talk more about Moonlight. So I want to look at one of these principles. To start with Moonlight, the character is the principal causal agency and causality is the prime unifying principle. I want to focus on this question of the character is the principal causal agency. Recall our other examples of classical Hollywood narration. Rear Window on the one hand, Gravity on the other. Think about the ways in which those films are really organized around each of those lead characters as having a sense of agency that causes many of the events of the film. Of course, there are accidents and contingencies, especially in Gravity, but the idea is that Sandra Bullock's narrative arc does revolve, in fact, around her own responsibility for her survival and an interior sense of surviving emotionally from the trauma that she had in the past.
No, we're just driving.
A similar thing can be attributed to Jimmy Stewart's character in Rear Window, that he takes matters into his own hands. It's his own insight paired with the insights of his girlfriend that he is able to uncover the murder in the film. And I want us to ask, to what extent do those principles of causal agency can be attributed to Chiron? Now let's take the main narrative event of the film, in which Chiron hits Tyrell in the back, kind of secures his fate, as one of the questions that we can ask. Does Chiron, in doing this central narrative act of the film, have principal causal agency? In a kind of simplified way, it seems like he does. No one forces him to retaliate. He picks up the chair and he hits Tyrell of his own volition. However, if we really think about the event and what causes this set of circumstances, I think the film is asking us to consider the role of agency in this action in a very complex way that is not often asked by classical Hollywood films. Let's take a step back and look at this moment where he seems to deliberate on the action, right? He has just been beaten by his friend, and he seems to be steeling himself for an act of retaliation. So it looks as if he has a kind of moment of reflection, a kind of agency attached to the action. But what causes this moment? Was Chiron the principal causal agency of Moonlight at this moment? And here I want you to start to consider the way in which the film is giving us details to suggest that there are a number of circumstances outside of Chiron's control that lead him to the choice to retaliate against Tyrell through violent means. Remember that he's talking with the principal. The principal asks him to press charges, and she says, if you don't press charges, things are going to go bad for you.
If you don't press charges, you can't stop this from happening. Understand?
But then you'll notice the way in which Chiron is hesitant to press charges. And why might he be hesitant to press charges? One detail might be this detail about masculinity.
You think all this just started, boy?
I ain't no boy.
The hell you ain't. If you were a man, there'll be 4 other knuckleheads sitting right next to you.
She calls him a boy, and he says, I ain't no boy, suggesting that there is this pressure to kind of be a quote-unquote man and not to rat out Tyrell, because doing so would bring other consequences upon Chiron that the principal is not exactly foregrounding in her arguments. right? So we have to consider the fact that telling the authorities is not exactly a clear and simple solution to this problem. And then we might take it a step back further to the act of violence against Chiron that led him to consider retaliation. Consider Kevin. Chiron's retaliation was indeed caused by Kevin's attack, but does Kevin have causal agency? He certainly did throw the punches. But we have to remember, of course, that what's significant is that Kevin was pushed into that act of violence. And there was this moment in which Tyrell encounters Kevin, in which Tyrell uses a kind of pressure to conform to normative, violent, aggressive masculinity. And if he doesn't, he has to face the social consequences of not adhering to that.
You remember that white kid you fucked up?
The Cuban cat, right? Mauricio or something?
Oh, yeah. Yo, you fucked that kid face up. Yo, he was calling you Tyson after that shit.
You dare me to swing on him, and if I do, it's on you.
All right. All right, Cap.
So now we have these other kind of systemic forces that are forcing Kevin, who throughout the film has only been a character of friendship and trust, to become the opposite of that. Now before that, when we look at Tyrell as a character, as a perhaps instigator of this very action, he's the one, after all, who tried to get Kevin to attack Chiron. He is the source of the aggression that's marked by a kind of homophobia and a general masculine aggressive bullying of the marginalized, right? So does Tyrell have causal agency? And I think in some ways we could say, yes, Tyrell has agency. He is a villain. But also, I think the film does not ask us to think of Tyrell as a source of evil who must be smited, right? The film almost suggests that he is part of a force, a kind of ideological force that is larger than himself. He just stands in for an ideology of masculine aggression within this community and within larger communities. So we go back here and we think, and we can say Chiron's decision is also made inevitable. That is not agentive or agential by factors beyond his control. Even though he picks up the chair, right, and he does this act of violence, so much about the actions leading up to that act of violence are asking us to question what are the sources, what are the step-by-step causes that lead him to this. And it mitigates the sense that Chiron is himself a causally potent agent in this world. And there are more factors that would mitigate this. So consider Chiron's loss of the stable father figure he has in Juan. We might have considered if Juan was living, Chiron would have maybe gone to him as a way to mitigate this almost impossible to solve social problem that he was encountering at school. But Juan has died in the film.
You and Juan, y'all two, thick as thieves. Give me that.
Why has Juan died? Because his job as a drug dealer is essentially violent. It is a job that encounters violence as one of the contingencies of the job. And we get that little detail here where he teaches the young Chiron about always having to protect himself. You can't sit with your back to the door.
Can't sit at my table like that. Can't sit with your back to the door. Come on. You're gonna know somebody creeping up on you.
So we have to consider the way in which Juan's death is also, in many ways, outside of his control. And it's important that the film doesn't actually depict Juan's death, but suggests it's a possibility and a probability that it was the result of violence. What about Chiron's need for Juan being partly motivated by his lack of a stable parent figure in his mother? Think about the character of Paula, right? Why is she not a stable parent figure? Because she gets into drugs. Drugs start to ruin her life. Chiron's mother's instability is also a result of her circumstances. I don't think there's any part of the film that tries to get us to look at Paula's slip into a life of drug abuse as one that we should attribute wholly to her own mistakes. I mean, there's a sense of responsibility there, but the film is trying to emphasize the systemic conditions that lead to these bad choices. I think if you watch the film in another way, you're missing the role that context plays here, right? And where does the film take place? Well, it takes place in Miami in the 1980s when Chiron is a little boy. Miami in the 1980s is the beginning of crack cocaine, right? This is the beginning of the war on drugs. And the film doesn't necessarily have a character tell us these statistics, but it uses context, the place and the time, to subtly mention the way in which this particular life, even though it's not necessarily personally mired in drugs, that is, Chiron's life is not himself personally mired in drug use, but everything around him is touched by these historical circumstances that are outside of individual people's control.
It's not a preachy film, but without talking about the prison industrial complex, it shows you that it's alive and well. Without talking about entrenched poverty, it shows you what it does.
So when we get to this big question, which I think all of you, when you watch the film, are asking, how did Chiron become this person? The answer is the entire film, not the way it is in, say, Gravity. How did Sandra Bullock become the person she is at the end of the film? Well, Gravity tries to tell us that she became this person sheerly through her own triumph of her will against the difficult circumstances that she was put into. Gravity is very much an American film in this way. It adheres to a kind of personal responsibility ethic. Moonlight, on the other hand, is trying to tell a story about the ways in which social conditions that are bound up in identities, such as what it means to grow up in an African American community in the 1980s in Miami, and also be a queer identifying person, that those circumstances will come together to produce a life that might look like this one. So let's go back to the 5 major traits of classical Hollywood narrative and ask, what else is Moonlight subverting? Let's consider this: a struggle to solve a problem or achieve specific goals, often two intertwined, one romantic, one another. So is there a problem to be solved in Moonlight? The problem to be solved is a broader question of identity, if there is a problem. Who is Chiron? In other words, what life will he live given his circumstances? And it's that problem is articulated by the characters. We have Juan saying at some point you got to decide for yourself who you're going to be.
At some point, you got to decide for yourself who you're going to be.
And then Kevin, at the end of the film, simply asks the question, who are you?
Who is you, man? Sandman in front. That car. Who is you, Chiron?
And this is not the kind of problem that a classical Hollywood film is going to pose as one to be solved, right? It's not the kind of problem of saying how you're going to survive in space or how you're going to nab a murderer, right? Those are the problems that a Hollywood film might pose as being able to solve. The problem of who am I, or who is this person, right? What is the nature of their identity within these circumstances is a much different kind of problem, right? It's not one that we can clearly show the solution to. What else do we have that is kind of problematized? Well, consider the way the film ends, right? Endings are a huge part of what makes a film classical. A decisive victory or defeat, problem solved, goals attained or not. So let's consider the ending of Moonlight. We don't know what will happen with Kevin, right? The identity plot of who is Chiron is given a satisfying ending only because it has just begun. The romance plot, if there is a romance plot, is left open-ended. In other words, most classical Hollywood romance films in which the romance plot is foregrounded tend to end with a secure sense that that couple is going to flourish, right? That's what it means to have a clear sense of an ending in a romance. It ends with a marriage or with a kiss or with a suggestion that they're going to end. So if a Hollywood film tends to end with a clear-cut sense of a romance, say, continuing or advancing onto the next stage, what does Moonlight do? Well, it takes this potential romance between Chiron and Kevin, right? He goes back to Kevin at the end of the film. It's significant. Well, what we get, if we have a sense of an ending, is not necessarily a clear sense that this shot with the two of them is the beginning of the romance of Kevin and Chiron. It's not foreclosed. It's very possible within the world of the film that this is what our imaginations may take away. But I think it's important to consider this point about intimacy. The problem with Chiron is not one of the romance. That is a series of obstacles that prevent him from attaining his love interest, in this case, Kevin, right? It's a much broader problem, which is that the world in which Chiron lives is preventing him from expressing and being a certain way. That is, there is no room in Chiron's community for his queer subjectivity, his queer desire, to be acknowledged and to flourish at all, right? In fact, he doesn't even know how to identify, given that this world is not allowing him to kind of honestly treat that. He says, "You're the only man that's ever touched me," to Kevin, right? So the fact that we have this moment of intimacy, of touch, that recounts this formative moment of intimacy, of touch, is, I think, trying to remind us that Moonlight is not a Hollywood romance film. That is not the obstacle that is trying to be overcome. It's a much deeper one. And the mere fact of having a sliver of intimacy is suggesting that Chiron's journey is not necessarily a romance with Kevin. It is an identity-based journey. Where he will discover more of who he is, given that he has this kind of new access point to a version of himself that he has suppressed.